let's do the news. There's a Comic-Con event coming up, but I definitely wanted to get this one in. Over the course of the last several weeks, there's been a sea change in regard to the way the media has been reporting on the issue of Ukraine. And I just want to point out that for the longest time, they've written all of these hit pieces against me or fault lines. They have basically say, oh, this guy is a Putin puppet, or he is pushing Russian propaganda. And yet, when you compare the work I've done versus the work they've done, I've been right. Meaning, our coverage on this has been more honest, has been more accurate. The people that we've had to talk about it have been more competent and knowledgeable. Speaking of Sloboda or Elijah McNeil, or for that matter, Scott Ritter. These guys have given a certain context of the war that is basically lined up with reality. And like I said before, at some point, the propaganda has to give way to reality. And that seems to be where we are now with Western media coming to Jesus, painfully, grudgingly coming to Jesus. No, they're not going to say anything about the fact that they were getting it wrong for months. They're not going to say that. They will come around as if this is some new reality that was taking place, despite the fact that everything that I've been reporting for the last several weeks is basically what they're reporting now. I've been right. Sitting on the moon, looking at events. What does it look like? It's just that. I am often, and I know I keep saying I'm astonished that this is taking place in the first place, meaning this level of a catastrophe. But there's a shocking, breathtaking level of incompetence that is coming out over and over again with one utterance after the next and one policy proposal after the next that gets across that these guys are in over their heads and they cannot necessarily entirely predict the consequences of what they're doing. Nevertheless, Biden is shuffling closer and closer to the blink of oblivion. What did I ask? Is Biden going to escalate or is Biden going to relent? Biden and in the administration, they've been having this kind of back and forth over what does escalation mean? How far can we go up to the line? Hey, we've been talking to our Russian counterparts because we don't want to miscommunicate. Their decision was to basically send more sophisticated weapons into Ukraine. Now, understand, to send more sophisticated weapons in Ukraine is almost a tacit admission that the economic war that you waged isn't working. And so you're stuck with a literal war that also isn't working. If you're looking at the reports, Severodonetsk fell, within like a week? Maybe not even a week? And if you're looking at how long it took for Mariupol to fall, it took weeks for Mariupol to fall. I guess the point that I'm making here is it seems that there's an acceleration of Ukrainian forces basically degrading. There are videos that I've been watching of Ukrainian forces basically saying we have lost the capacity to fight. Most reports are talking about this low level of morale. All of these guys beginning to think that they're cannon fodder. And let's be honest, they are. For Zelensky and some of these guys to basically make pronunciations, we're going to take back Crimea and we're going to take down the Black Sea Fleet. If you're going to be making those proclamations, okay, how are you going to do that? It seems that the Donbass region is falling. Your troops that are in Kramatorsk-Slavyansk, those troops are now in range of artillery fire. So, if indeed it is falling faster, which it is, if indeed your troops are basically calling themselves cannon fodder, which they are, and if indeed Zelensky is basically making this choice of, I can lose the Donbass and I can continue to fight. I can lose it and I continue to fight. Then how are those people not cannon fodder in that situation? That as long as he gets money and weapons and materials, that in his head, these weapons and this money can add to additional training. We can have additional troops, conscripts. We can train them on these additional new weapons. These new weapons are going to be more advanced, and we're going to be able to push. This is what they're saying anyway. Whether they're thinking that in real terms, who knows? Alexander McCarthy's made the point that it seems like they're basically just training people for a few days and then sending them right out to the front. With this idea that we need to hold on to every patch of land that we can hold on to. That way, when we go into negotiations, we'll be able to say at the very least we're holding on to that land. The problem with this line of logic is it doesn't necessarily seem that they're holding up. Like I said, if you're going with somewhat of a rational plan, even though it is cynical, that all of the weapons that you're getting from the standpoint of the West, it gives you that much more time to train troops, to get additional weapon systems in, to create a hard point, let's say from the standpoint of from the West, and use that as a way of potentially attacking for counterattacks in the East. That does mean, however, that you're perfectly capable and willing to lose 10, 15,000, how many ever troops that you basically have in the East in order to create the strong point in the West where you can go by and do your counterattacks. It is a cynical ploy, very cynical. But what if that's not what they're doing? What if, indeed, instead of creating a strong point, they are indeed just sending people out to the front lines with this idea of holding on to territory? Well, the logic still holds that basically every Ukrainian that you're basically sitting out there to basically die while you take time to do something else, the time frame in which those people die increases. Meaning whatever the value is, whatever that value of time, X, it takes X amount of time for this particular person to get out there to die and the Russians can move forward. Whatever that time frame is, it seems that that increment for X is decreasing. Meaning at a certain point, it doesn't matter that you're sending people out for cannon fodder. The Russians are basically cutting through your men faster and faster and faster to the point where you may lose the entirety of the Donbass. If you are not building a hard point in the West, if you're not training and getting conscripts and creating some kind of power center where you can basically hold off larger attacks, or for that matter, make inroads, then I don't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, one plan is cynical, but there's a logic to it. The other one of just sending out cannon fodder just seems absurd. But nevertheless, here we are. It has to be one of them because it has to be one or the other, right? Here's the thing. The U.S., despite quibbling over escalation, and they're very concerned about escalation, and there's all sorts of questions, right? What does that even mean? If you're saying, will Russia escalate because of the United States putting in more advanced weapon systems, what does that mean? If the weapon systems that the United States are putting in has a potential to hit Russia proper, how will Russia retaliate? Will they put weapon systems in other countries? What about the theaters of war that you guys are involved in? Will they start putting weapons and logistics into the hands of the various people who you're in opposition to in those various other countries? For that matter, will they do that stuff in South America somewhere, especially in countries that are allied, let's say maybe a Cuba, or for that matter, a Venezuela? They don't know. And because they don't know, they're greatly concerned that it could be an escalation in such a way that they cannot save political face to back away from the brink of oblivion. At the very least, they're having those conversations, and yet they're still coming away with an assessment of, we got to keep going. We got to keep these guys fighting, and we got to keep some kind of level thing where we can just keep this conflict bubbling. And so what they decided, they decided to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine with one caveat, that the Ukrainian military, or that Zelensky would pinky swear that he would not use those to attack Russia proper. So now the U.S. policy is based on a pinky swear from Zelensky. Right here, this part. The Biden administration announced Wednesday that it would send Ukraine $700 million in new military aid, including M142 high mobility artillery rocket system, more commonly referred to as HIMARS. The weapon fires a barrage of rockets with an effective range of around 30 kilometers, but can also deploy tactical ballistic missiles that increase to 300 kilometers. All right. So you were concerned about escalation. You have escalated by putting in a more advanced weapon system into the hands of Ukraine. And you, concerned about escalation and not wanting Russia to do anything that will, let's say, turn this context into something where the U.S. basically is put into a position where it is forced to either defend one of the countries that got involved in that conflict or not, in which case the entire premise of NATO falls apart. This is the ridiculous position that these guys have basically put themselves into, provoking a war, then initiating an economic war, then keeping this other literal war going, because they can't accept the fact that they basically lost. And they understand that Ukraine is basically collapsing at a faster rate. In their heads, we need to somehow slow down the decay of the Ukrainian military. And the way we can do that is by putting in more advanced weapon systems. Can those weapon systems get to the line of combat? Who knows? Probably not. Maybe in some cases, yes, but in many cases, the answer may be no. Either way, they want the weapon systems. Will Ukraine agree to not strike Russia territory with the weapons that the United States is given? Now, Blinken comes out and says, yes. Blinken says they made an agreement. We got a pinky swear. Specifically with regards to weapon systems we provided, the Ukrainians have given assurances that they will not use the system against target on Russian territory, Blinken said during the press conference alongside NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg. All right, fair enough. Fair enough. Question. What is Russian territory? What is Russian territory? Now, you may think that question is easy, but think about it for a moment. These guys are basically having a fight now where Ukraine and what it means to be Ukraine is being carved up, balkanized, and whatever limps out of the remnants of this particular war from the standpoint of Ukraine will be different. It will be different. And however long this war goes on, it will be less and less and less of whatever its former self was. Meaning, the longer this war goes on, the more Russia is going to want, from the standpoint of negotiations, for them propagating this war in the first place, not to mention the men and material that they had to basically add to something that should have never taken place, meaning the war should have never happened in the first place if you had had rational actors. All of these guys were being maximalists in their positioning on that. So the longer it goes, the worse the deal Ukraine is going to get. What is Russia? Is the Crimea part of Russia? What about the Donbass region? Are those independent republics? And even if you take out the Donbass for a moment, some of those places may join Russian Federation. But from the standpoint of the Crimea, is the Crimea Russian territory? Now, 90% of them decided to basically leave and go back to Russia at the point where the coup government took over, and they realized that the people who were in charge were A, illegitimate, B, Russophobic, and C, hostile to their very existence. They decided to go back to Russia to the tune of over 90%. Is it Russian territory? And does Ukraine consider it Russian territory? And therein lies the rub. Are you guys so comically inept where you did not define what exactly was meant by Russian territory? And the reason why I'm asking this is because despite Blinken's statement, Zelensky's advisor is saying this. Right here. This is, I think his name, Richrovik. Kiev may strike Crimea, a Ukrainian presidential aide says, despite assurances U.S. weapons won't be used to hit Russian territory. Ukraine will use U.S.-supplied rocket systems to strike into Russian territory should it deem such attacks necessary, Ukrainian presidential advisor Alexei Richrovik said on Thursday. Crimea is ours, it belongs to Ukraine, and they know it. All right. So which one is it? Is it what Blinken said, that we will not strike into Russian territory, or they gave us assurances? Or is it what the presidential advisor is basically saying in Ukraine, saying, if a target presents itself, we're going to hit it because we don't consider Crimea to be part of Russia? This is astonishing. The level of incompetence that these guys are basically propagating with is astonishing. How did you not nail down the term of what it means to be Russia when they are literally having a fight over what it will mean to even be Ukraine going forward? And one of the things that are basically on the table, not on the table from the Russian perspective, but definitely something that the Ukrainians keep saying, we're going to take back Crimea. What happens? What happens if they use those weapons to go after Crimea for whatever particular reason? And secondary to that point, does a country that is in an existential struggle, which Ukraine is at this point, will it or does it have an incentive to expand the boundaries of the war? Meaning whatever deal they struck with the United States, if Ukraine is losing, if the United States is only giving Ukraine just enough to keep it going, even though it's keeping it going into a losing situation, does Ukraine have an incentive in order to expand the boundaries of the war, knowing that if the war keeps going the way it is, they are just going to basically lose? And they're going to lose more and more territory, more and more men, more and more materials. And for that matter, at a certain point, what is Ukraine after that? I mean, at this point, they're saying Russia has taken 15% of Ukrainian territory. The attacks or counterattacks that they're talking about in Kherson and Kharkiv, those things have gone nowhere. Not just gone nowhere. The reports I'm reading have shown that Ukrainians have suffered massive losses as a result of that. So, is Crimea part of Russia? And here's another question. Does it matter? Does Ukraine's perspective of that matter? Meaning, if the United States is concerned about escalation, and the reason they're trying to get assurances that Ukraine won't attack Russia proper is that basically we don't want to escalate this conflict. We want to just keep this conflict bubbling as it is. This is what we want. Is that in Ukraine's interest? Yeah or nay? And of course, the answer is no. Should or does the U.S. care? Or does anybody else care? Does it even matter? Anybody else's perspective on what is the Crimea? Meaning, if Russia sees it as Russian territory, that's all that matters. I mean, understand from the standpoint of escalation, your concern is that you're not going to do something that Russia is going to interpret that requires a response that goes beyond the response that you yourself are framing. Fair enough. But what that means is that's entirely dependent upon the Russian perspective of things. And if you weren't able to nail that down to Ukraine about, hey, look, this is part of Russia, you can't attack that, then how is Ukraine wrong for saying from their point of view, from their assessment of things, especially if that wasn't necessarily something that was nailed down, that yes, we believe that the Crimea is up for grabs. We believe that is our territory. We believe that if something is there, those are legitimate targets, we're going to take those targets. We don't care what the U.S. says. And you can even say, well, we said we were going to hit Russian territory, but we don't consider that Russian territory, which again gets to the level of incompetence of not nailing that down. Some people are basically saying, okay, either Biden is lying or Ukraine is lying. No, neither one of them have to be lying. The only thing you need is a certain level of incompetence built into it where nobody thought to ask what actually is Russian territory. And regardless of what Russian territory is from the standpoint of Ukraine, are there areas that you would forbid the Ukrainian military from using your weapons that are in question from the standpoint of Ukraine, but are not in question from the standpoint of Russia? And again, if Russia and the perspective of Russia is the only thing that matters in this situation, again, because we're talking about the issue of escalation, then how do you not have that conversation? How do you not make that clear in your dialogue with Kiev as you're giving them logistics and other weapons and money in order to kill as many Russians as possible? How do you not make that clear that, hey, Crimea is off limits? I understand that you believe it's yours. That's secondary to the point that the Russians don't. It is firmly in their hand. Those people decided to leave. And whatever, even if we agreed with you on your premise that Crimea is Ukrainian territory, the consequences and the ramifications of you attacking that territory without weapons are such that you can't do it. That seemed to be something that they would have basically had a conversation about. And yet, here we are in the press with Blinken saying one thing and Ukraine basically saying something else. Yes, there's a logic on some level to what each of them saying, meaning they don't necessarily have to be lying. But the fact that they didn't necessarily coordinate what that meant, oh man, it gets to the level of stupidity that all of this has basically been taking place on. How do you consistently and continuously come up with ideological positions that you in no way have the physical matter, reality, constituents, meaning from the standpoint of your countries, in order to accommodate? So Europe decides they want to have an economic war and immediately go into a recession. What, it's been like 3 months? And they're basically going headlong into a recession with the UK wondering how they're going to pay their heating bills. And that doesn't even hit the U.S., where we are basically, 1.4% drop from the standpoint of GDP. And when we're looking at Russia, they have gained more money. Don't take my word for it. You can even look at Western press at this point that would admit such. I guess what I'm getting at here is it seemed that one step after the next was done with a comic book level of incompetence without the very constituents of, hey, can we support the position that we're actually pushing here? What are going to be the consequences of the position that we're basically pushing here? If we're going to take a maximalist position on this issue of NATO membership, what will Russia do? I mean, none of these are just basic questions that look like you would have if you're basically running a country and you care about the outcomes of those countries, especially if you're taking certain policies that are basically decimating the economies of not just your countries, but the countries in Europe, while simultaneously giving your enemy a windfall in profits. Incompetence. When I say this is the worst administration in the history of administrations, I mean it. And like I said, I'm including Donald Trump in this. I get the feeling that even Donald Trump would have been more competent in these matters. I'll leave it here. I don't want to keep it long. Like, share, subscribe. Very basic point. Blinken is saying, we've gotten assurances that they won't use long-range weapons. Zelensky's advisor comes out. Crimea is not Russian territory. Crimea is not Russian territory. And like I said, it sounds like a contradiction, but it's not really a contradiction, right? If that's not something you nail down, and from Ukraine's perspective, this is still something we're fighting to get back, that's a problem. If those weapons are used in Crimea, Russia considers Crimea Russian territory. You've basically set a context with a loophole that for whatever particular reason you didn't see, didn't know was there, or didn't have the competence to even intellectually engage before making a decision to basically escalate sending additional and that much more advanced weapon systems. This is so pathetic. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe.